There has been no scientific response to this article from industry or government. And then, a couple of years ago, Professor Vivian Howard, who used to be at the University of Liverpool, is now in the University of Ulster in Coleraine. He wrote a fantastic 30-page summary of nanoparticles. He wrote a book on nanoparticles in 1999, and he summarized the literature. It's a brilliant summary. If anybody wants a copy, I have a copy on my laptop here. If you've got a thumb drive, pen drive, I can give a copy. If you give me an email address, I'll send it to you, because it's really important. And again, no scientific response to this review from either industry or government. Instead, we have the Health Protection Agency simply declaring by fiat that a modern, well-run incinerator poses no health risk. They don't know. Arrogance is ignorance backed up with overconfidence. They don't know the levels of nanoparticles coming out of incinerators. They don't measure the nanoparticles coming out of incinerators, but they're just assuming, based upon a very few studies, that there are no health risks near incinerators. I think that's highly unlikely. And this gives you, again, just to remind you of how effective, how brilliant your protection agencies are at finding problems and protecting the public. That, to me, is a metaphor for the ability of British government agencies to actually protect you. But, changing gears dramatically, even if we made incineration safe, we would never make it sensible. The modern incinerator is attempting to perfect a bad idea. Our task in the 21st century is not to find better ways to destroy discarded materials. Our task is to stop making packaging and products that have to be destroyed. And that's the central message of the zero waste. That's what's different about this thing. Instead of just being totally preoccupied with disposing anything the industry cares to throw at us in their throwaway products, we put a foot down and say, no, if we can't recycle it, reuse it, or compost it, then industry shouldn't be making it. We also need, at the personal level, to search for a lifestyle beyond consumerism. But there's a lot of low-lying fruit before we get to that challenge. So how do these arguments I've given so far, I'm going to go into the alternatives in a moment, but how do they relate to the Tata proposal? Well, problems with the Tata project. First of all, they've done an elaborate study on carbon savings calculations. And I think those carbon saving calculations are either wrong or optimistic. And they use, as I mentioned earlier, the incinerator industry's self-serving analysis. They restrict their comparison between burning this stuff and assuming that if they don't burn it, it all gets landfilled. And I say, nonsense. You should be comparing this with recycling and composting. I'll talk about that in a second. They also assume that the only fate of these residuals for the next 25 years or even 30 years, because that's the financing period for this, that's how long normally you have to pay this thing off, is going to be landfill. And again, I think it's highly unlikely that this goes back to what I said earlier. The next 25 years, you're going to see major inroads being made into their fuel. And what happens then? Well, let's talk about it. This will affect their carbon calculations. It will also affect their economic viability in the future. So, the carbon savings calculations are wrong. They should have been comparing burning with composting for the biodegradable materials in the residuals. That's what the comparison should have been, between burning and composting. Or if you like, burning and anaerobic digestion. Not comparing between burning and landfill. And secondly, remember the argument here? If you burn that, that's compost. If you burn it, then all that wood becomes carbon dioxide, but that wood is going to stay in the soil for anything from 1 to 10 or more years. Carbon savings calculations are wrong. They should be comparing burning of the non-biodegradables like plastics, rubber, textiles with recycling. And as I showed you before, at least 10 times more energy saved by recycling plastics than burning them to produce electricity. Yes, the equation is better if they produce steam as well, but it's still more energy saved by recycling. But that doesn't appear in their calculations at all. They don't even talk about it. And again, I would remind you of those ratios. Remember that PET plastic, 26 times more energy saved. Now, also it's optimistic. They assume that all the bottom ash will be reused. And they're assuming there's going to be a market for this, and for 25 years or 30 years. And as I already mentioned, in the United States, companies that were set up, Ash Recycling Corporation in Nashville, Tennessee, went bankrupt. People, once they know about the toxics in this ash, don't want to put it into buildings, don't want to put it into roads. And about a year ago, putting ash into roads in England, it burst into flames. There was fire, and the Department of Transport is, I think, now advising not to use that for roads. So this promise, which, by the way, I should preface this by saying, I've heard incinerator companies for the last 25 years promising that the ash is going to be reused. And for 25 years, I've seen it not reused and going into landfills. Now that makes a big economic difference to them, and it also makes a difference to their economic calculations here. It assumes a shipping distance of waste by road will be 75 miles for 25 years. That means they think that for 25 to 30 years, they're going to be able to get all the waste that they need within 75 miles of this plant. I think that is highly unlikely. You've already heard from Chain that in this area they're talking about dealing with 1.9 million tons where you produce 200,000 or 300,000 tons. So, they're going to have to go further and further to get this stuff. And therefore their carbon calculations are out of the window the moment they go further than 75 miles. This assumes that there will be a ready supply of the energy-rich waste for 25 years within these distances. Now, let's have a look at that. Assumes a steady supply of energy-rich waste for 25 years. I think that's unlikely. Let me explain why. Number one, as oil prices continue to rise, we will not be able to afford to burn plastics. Number one. Number two, with Chinese and Indian demands, other secondary material prices are going to rise. It's totally predictable. This huge demand. They're building 1 power station a week in China. Their production is incredible. Their growth rate's, what, about 8 or 9% a year? It's incredible. This enormous, these two avaricious countries are consuming, consuming, and consuming. And that is going to make a difference in the value of these secondary materials. And just like these people in Kent, they're going to get a big surprise when they go to try to get this material and find it's going elsewhere. It assumes that the government will continue a surcharge on landfilling without introducing a surcharge on incineration. Imagine if they did that. There was a surcharge on incineration. That would suddenly throw a huge spanner in their economics. And also if the government did what it should be doing and putting those rebates in, then again, more and more communities would be reducing, reusing, recycling and composting, and we'd see again a dramatic decrease in the quantity of materials that they are able to receive. And again, I remind you, this is what we're talking about. If we can get that, it's common sense, it makes economic sense. If we can get that through, then they're in deep trouble. It assumes a steady state of energy. Right now, listen to this, right now the emphasis on recycling, etc., has been on domestic waste. Everybody's talking about domestic waste. But as our chairman said over here, we hardly know anything about commercial and industrial waste, and it's not going to be long before the same kind of pressures from the government will be placed on industry to do more sensible things than just landfill or burn this stuff. And again, when that happens, there will be less